Hello, Warbirders. Today I'd like to start off with a few podcasting housekeeping items. I would like to sincerely thank my latest Patreon supporters. For basically the cost of one Starbucks per month, they are helping to keep this podcast going. And this is a tangible thing. Their support helped me to finally replace my old laptop, the one that required sticking a copper wire into a hole where the start button used to be. So now it is much easier to write and record and provide for you the stories of these warbirds that we all love so much. So to the following, I would like to extend my deepest thanks. I apologize if I am getting your name wrong, because sometimes I have to make a guess based on the email address, or I would have to use sometimes flowery usernames like silver-haired, middle-aged, tuxedo mask. Yeah, that's a real username. So here goes. Thank you to all the following: Robert Miles, Peter Clark, Eric Burke-Kemper, Stanislav Stanchev, John Hartman, Scott Mays, Jimmy Pulse, Matt Van X, Tim Rathbone, Cody Leatherwood, John Can, John Hall, Bon K or Bon K or Bon K, I'm not quite sure how we pronounce that one, Stein Andreas Asland, Felix Saint-Jean, Guy Brandon, Dominique, Don Nicholas, and Dale Longmere. The following have also helped me out via PayPal, and I thank them too: Peter Taff, Stan Marcus, Robert Miles, Malcolm Nykirk, and Tobias Belloc. I promise I will try to keep up with the shout-outs moving forward. If you take the time to support me, I will take the time to properly thank you. Now, on to today's show. Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Today's episode is due to a suggestion by listener Brian O'Connor. And although many of you may have submitted suggestions earlier than this one, I decided to bump this one right up to the top of the list, because his email actually hit me like a lightning bolt. And you can decide on what kind of lightning bolt it was, whether it was a P-38 or the F-35 Lightning II. Over the course of this podcast, we've looked at planes from Germany, the UK, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, the USA, and even Australia and Canada. But we have never looked at a single aircraft from Poland, even though the war in Europe began there. So let's start righting this wrong right away. In 1917, there were informal Polish air units formed even before the actual independence of the country. However, the actual Polish Air Force was established on November 11th, 1918. Initially, the Polish Air Force used leftover German and Austrian aircraft. In 1919, war broke out with Soviet Russia, and Poland purchased and operated a variety of World War I era foreign aircraft from Britain, France, Germany, Austria, and Italy. After that conflict ended, the weary World War I birds were gradually retired and replaced mainly with French aircraft. Although some Czech designs were license-built in Poland, and the PWS-10, which was a high-wing fighter, was a Polish-designed and built aircraft, indicated the beginnings of a fledgling Polish aviation industry. A major player in this nascent industry was Zygmunt Pulowski. He was born in 1901 and had served in a Boy Scout battalion during the aforementioned Polish-Soviet War. Following that, in late 1920, he began studying at the Warsaw University of Technology and joined the aviation section of the Students' Mechanical Club, where he began building gliders. After obtaining his engineering degree, he worked for an aviation company in France and then returned to Poland to do his national service, where he became a military pilot. In 1927, he became the chief designer of the PZL, which was the State Aviation Works in Poland. In 1928, there was a push by the government to create a new, modern, and Polish-built fighter aircraft. Pawlowski and his team came up with the P.11, which was an all-metal monoplane fighter with a fixed gear and powered by a 630 horsepower Hispano-Suiza inline engine. One very distinguishing feature of this aircraft and its later sisters was the high gull wing, which was known as the Pawlowski or Polish wing. It allowed for much greater visibility for the pilot than other high-wing monoplanes. The program could have ended in disaster during the very first flight in August 1929 when the prototype's wing somehow failed in the air. But the pilot managed to bring the machine back and the project was allowed to continue. The second prototype had a strengthened wing and was successful, but it didn't begin actual production because a decision had been made to use radial engines, so a new design was needed. The next model, the PZL P6, which was then developed into the production P7, first flew in August 1930. It was powered by the Bristol Jupiter 6, which was a 9-cylinder radial engine. Bristol built over 7,000 of these engines, and they powered a staggering number of different aircraft. The engine was supercharged for better performance at higher altitudes, and the addition of a Townend cowling ring over the cylinders reduced drag and increased performance. Although with our modern eyes, the P7 looks fat and pokey, it actually won the American National Air Races in fall 1931. About 150 of them were built, although Pawlowski was not resting on his laurels and was already developing updates that culminated in the main subject of today's episode, the P-11C. It featured updates to the fuselage, including a lowering of the engine to give the pilot an even better exterior view. It was also up-engined to the stronger Mercury 5, which also had a smaller diameter, which reduced drag. This engine turned a 2-bladed wooden prop. Flame dampeners were installed for night duties. The cockpit was larger and more comfortable, with the pilot's seat raised by 5 centimeters for even better visibility, and there was an oxygen system for the pilot. One interesting feature that I've never heard of anywhere else was that the internal fuel tank could be jettisoned in case of fire or other emergency. Talk about dumping fuel. For weapons, the P-11 was equipped with 2 7.92mm synchronized machine guns mounted on the sides of the fuselage. And some versions had 2 more machine guns fixed onto the wings, which did not need to be synchronized as they fired outside of the prop disc. Some P-11s were able to carry up to 4 small 30-pound bombs. For a time, the P-11 was one of the most advanced aircraft in the world. Poland built 325 of them for themselves and exported others to Romania, and other countries were interested. That was pretty good for a country that had heretofore used leftover aircraft or imported them. That's why the next part of our story is so tragic. We've all heard about how one person can make a difference. Some of us who are a little more cynical might roll our eyes at this, but there are times where truly one man can change history, and I think this is one of them. Up until this point, the talented and gifted Pawlowski had guided the development of the Polish fighter program, keeping it in line with the other more established countries of the time, such as Germany, France, and Britain. But on March 21st, 1931, Pawlowski died in a crash of his newest design, an amphibious flying boat called the PZL-12. He was only 29. From that point on, the Polish program seemed to falter and stagnate. There were no significant updates to the P-11. And in 1939, when the Luftwaffe invaded Polish skies, the P-11 was the fighter that rose to try to stop it. But it was no longer the cutting-edge airplane that it had been just a few years before. It really makes me wonder if Pulowski had survived, if he would have shepherded the Polish fighter program along, and they might have had something that was equal to, or maybe even a little better than the Messerschmitt Bf-109 when the war broke out. Things might have turned out a little differently. In terms of operational history, it was good that the Polish Air Force had dispersed their fighter forces before the German invasion. But that was just about the only bright fact. Not only were the P-11s obsolete, they were also now old and weary from use. And so they couldn't even make their theoretical book performance. They were outpaced by not only the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Bf-110s, but even some of the Luftwaffe's bombers had better performance than this Polish fighter. The very first air victory of World War II was a PZL P-11C shot down by a Stuka, although shortly later the score was evened when the very first Allied air victory of the war was a Stuka being shot down by a P-11. Although completely outclassed, the P-11s did have some advantages. They were more maneuverable than the German fighters and had better pilot visibility from the cockpit, which was still of the open cockpit type. The P-11 was tough and could operate from rough, short airfields and could climb and dive very well. The P-11 scored better than could really be expected, knocking down an estimated 110 for the loss of about 100 of their own. Although they put up a good fight, it was a rearguard action to say the least. In the grinding aerial fighting, most of the P-11s were eventually destroyed in 1939. But 36 were flown to Romania and were adopted by the Romanian Air Force, who used some for training while cannibalizing the rest for spare parts. It was an inauspicious end for an aircraft that had one time been award-winning and one of the best in the world. There is only one surviving P-11C aircraft, which is now on display in the Polish Aviation Museum in Krakow. Now let's take a look at a pilot that flew the P-11. Stanislaw Skalski was born on the 27th of November 1915. And in 1936, he began his military and pilot training. After graduation in 1938, Skalski was sent to the 142nd Fighter Squadron in Turin. On the first day of the German invasion, he was airborne in his P-11 and attacked a German Henschel HS-126. Although it was actually one of his mates that eventually shot down the reconnaissance aircraft, Skalski landed next to it and gave first aid to the wounded crew members, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. The very next day, 2 formations of Dornier Do-217 bombers were inbound, and 9 P-11s of the 142 Squadron, including one piloted by Skalski, intercepted them over the river Vistula. The Polish fighters executed a head-on attack and managed to shoot down 7 of the twin-engine bombers. 2 of these were credited to Skalski. By the 16th of September, Skalski had shot down a Junkers Ju-86, the 2 Dornier Do-17s, 1 Junkers Ju-87, and 2 HS-126s, making him the very first Allied air ace of the Second World War. But that was the end of his career flying P-11s. But it was not the end of his flying career. The very next day, on the 17th of September, Skalski evacuated to Romania. From there, he booked passage on a Greek ship sailing to Beirut and then to Marseille, France. Eventually, he ended up sailing to Great Britain. Following some training, he was assigned to fly a Hurricane in number 501 Squadron, where he shot down a Henkel 111 bomber and 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. On the 5th of September, Skalski himself was shot down and was forced to bail out. During the jump, he collided with the Hurricane's stabilizer and was knocked out. He never remembered opening the parachute, which he must have done subconsciously. He landed in a beet field and was hospitalized for 6 weeks due to severe burns. He returned to his unit in late October 1940. In March 1941, he and his new unit, number 306, the Polish Squadron RAF, began flying circus missions over France, going looking for trouble. Skalski found it on the 15th of August 1941 when he crashed while landing his Spitfire after returning from a circus. In October 1942, Skalski assumed command of the Polish fighting team, the PFT, which was a team of 15 veteran Polish fighter pilots volunteering to operate in North Africa. The unit became known as the Cirque Skalskiego, or Skalski's Circus. During this campaign, Skalski shot down 4 aircraft. Skalski became the very first Pole to command a RAF squadron, number 601, County of London, and took part in the invasion of Sicily and the invasion of Italy. On the 24th of June 1944, Skalski was bounced by Bf-109s, but he ended up saving ammo by jinxing his P-51 Mustang in a sudden darting action, causing the 2 109s to hit each other and crash. He was sent on a training course for officers at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff Office at Fort Leavenworth in the United States. Following the war, he was in command of the British Air Forces of Occupation in Germany. In December 1946, he joined the Polish Resettlement Corps, and in June 1947, he returned to Poland. His record was 18 victories, making him the highest-scoring Polish ace. He was highly decorated with many Polish awards and the Distinguished Flying Cross from the UK with 2 bars. His life took an even more dramatic turn when in 1948 he was arrested under the false charge of espionage and sentenced to death. After multiple years of waiting for the execution, his sentence was modified to life imprisonment. In 1956, he was released and allowed to rejoin the military. In 1972, he retired, but in 1988, he was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. In March 1990, Skalski was in Germany, where he met Fritz Wiemer, the pilot of the Henschel whom he had landed to help way back in 1939 on the first day of the war. He also met the twin brother of the second crew member who he had also helped. The former foes expressed their deep gratitude for his aid. Oh, to have been a fly on the wall to hear those war stories. Thanks for listening to this episode on this Polish fighter aircraft. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I did in researching and writing it, because I didn't know a whole lot about Polish aviation before starting it. There are a couple of other Polish aircraft that will be profiled in the future. Thanks again to all who support this podcast through Patreon, PayPal, or even with your likes and shares. I highly appreciate it. You can check out some of the photos of what we've been talking about on the Patreon page, and remember, those are available to all for free. Until next time.